Okay, I think we can start. I'm Yunus from Kogist, and we have Harry Heft from Denison University. Um, sorry for okay. Oops. Ah, nice. Here we have Harry Heft from Denison University with us, and we are all here for James Gibson's birthday. James Gibson was born on January 27, and made groundbreaking contributions to psychology during his 75-year life. Primarily working in perception and ecological psychology, Gibson revolutionized the field with his theory of affordances, which emphasized the direct perception of opportunities for action in an environment, rather than mediating internal processes like inferences or algorithms in mind or brain. His ecological approach to perception challenged mainstream views, emphasizing the relationship between an organism and its environment over isolated sensory inputs. Gibson's influential works, including The Perception of the Visual World and The Ecological Approach to Visual Perception, reshaped how psychologists and cognitive scientists understand perception and behavior. His legacy extends far beyond psychology, influencing disciplines such as design, robotics, and education. James Gibson passed away in 1979, and we will commemorate his life and impact on cognitive science and psychology today with two talks, one in English and one in Turkish. For the first talk, Harry Heft accepted our invitation with much generosity. Thank you again for that. Heft is one of the prominent figures in ecological psychology. His research has, for the most part, focused on how humans navigate their environment, particularly the environmental information used to learn paths and routes. Current studies aim to explore how this root knowledge can be used to develop a broader understanding of a place's overall configuration. He has also investigated the perception of affordances along with the development of children's navigational skills, environmental aesthetics, and the impact of home noise in cognitive development. I would like to thank him once again for accepting the invitation, and also thank you all for your interest and being here with us. Professor Harry, can you please go ahead and
Okay. Is it, the first slide? Oops. No, I'm sorry. I have to shoot. There we go. Okay. Does that look okay from your end?
yeah,
Good. Okay. Let me just be clear what I'm doing here. It because it's a celebration of James Gibson's birthday. I'm going to just offer pretty much an introduction to Gibson's approach. So for some of you, if you're quite familiar with Gibson's ideas, I'm afraid a lot of this, of what I have to say will be um, not new to you. But I'm not going to talk about the work post after Gibson died, and nor am I going to talk about any of my own work. But it seems to me that some of Gibson's ideas in the haze of time have been a little bit confused, and also other developments that have come up, which I'll refer to, might lead folks to have a lack of clarity as to what he's doing. So I'm really starting from the very beginning. And the title that was on the announcement was The Psychological Habitat from an Ecological Perspective, and I'm indeed going to be doing that. But it's sort of woven into all this. So again, I didn't know who my audience would be. I suspect there's people with a wide range of prior experiences, but I apologize in advance if some of this is too elementary. The other thing I want to mention is that it's not surprising that if you've read Gibson's work, you might have started with his last book, which was published the year that he died in 1979. Um, but the core of his project really comes earlier. It comes with an earlier book published in 1966, which I'll talk about. So anyway, and instead of beginning at the end of his career, I'm going to begin kind of in the middle. So what I've learned in studying Gibson's work and really being interested in philosophical theory is how we think about perception depends upon our starting point. And so therefore we have to ask ourselves, what are our beginning assumptions? And so I'm going to identify the starting point of three current approaches to the study of visual perception. One I'll loosely refer to as a mechanistic approach. And the starting point is just trying to understand how machines operate. Won't spend a lot of time on that. And then I will then focus on the ecological approach. And its starting point is the organism's history of functioning adaptively in a structured and changing environment. That environment, in my current work, refer to it as a nested hierarchy, but I won't talk too much about that. There's a third approach, which is very popular now, and we call it the inactive approach, and it has a very different starting point from the other two. It begins with the idea of self-organizing systems and focuses on the organismic bounded processes, which I'll be clear to now on. But I won't come back to this until the very end of the talk because I want to mostly just contrast the mechanistic and the ecological approach. I'll come back to the inactive approach at the end as long as there's time. So what is the mechanistic approach? It takes seeing, that is vision, as being conceptualized primarily as an image capturing process. And here's a very early figure that many of you might have seen. It's from Descartes, and he's trying to describe here how we perceive in this case, length. But notice that critical in this, for my purposes, in this figure, is that it's visual perception from a fixed position. The observer is not moving. Why start here? Well, if any of you have read any of my work, you know that I have a penchant for history. So I want to talk about the history of this, first of all. It began by thinking about visual perception by analogy. And the analogy is the pinhole camera, the camera obscura. As you probably know, you can get this effect of the projection of an image on the back wall of this dark camera by allowing a pinhole of light through it, and the projection of the image is on a flat surface upside down and so on. The pinhole camera has been known about since at least the 4th century BC. By the 15th century in Europe, the camera obscura, or the pinhole camera, was used as a tool. And it was used as a tool to aid in the drawing of realistic pictures. And it plays a really important part in the development of art history, particularly representational art. But then the tool becomes a concept when Kepler posits that vision begins with a projection of an image on the back of the eye, on the retina. Again, it's the camera obscura idea, but now applied to vision. And why did he say that? Because when he sort of looked into the anatomy of the eye, what he saw is a projection of the world in front of the eye onto a light sensitive surface, the retina. And so Kepler writes, there's vision when representation of the whole hemisphere of the world that is before the eye fixes itself on the reddish white concave surface of the retina. I think most of you are familiar with this, but the problem is this generates all sorts of problems if you're trying to explain visual perception. And I'm assuming that most of you are familiar with this, so I won't spend a lot of time. But one is that the projected size of the object in front of the eye varies as a function of its distance from the retina. So what happens is that we experience objects as being relatively constant in size, but if we just look at the optics, the projection of the image on the retina, that's a puzzle because in fact the projected image will change with relative distance. It also creates the problem of retinal shape because projected retinal shape varies with the point of observation. So if we're looking at a cube, we can see that as it turns or we walk around it, it's going to change its projected shape on the retina. So this presented a huge problem for visual theorists, and it was worked on for centuries. Um, so how was this dealt with? Well, it was dealt with mechanistically, pretty much. Mechanistic models were proposed to address these problems. And the idea here is you have a person in front of the perceiver, Ralph, and the image of Ralph that you experience in your head, but your brain does all these mechanical workings to kind of solve the problem of how tall and what his shape truly is. And so decades and decades of work have been put on trying to understand the mechanisms that solve these two problems and many others. So we end up having an account of perceiving where the functioning of the brain is really very much machine-like. And that's ultimately what Descartes' model uh, does, but I'm not going to talk about his theory in any detail. Just so that we're not just stuck in the past, the most influential book of the past decades that adopts this view is the book by David Marr called Vision. And you can see with regard to visions, Marr's argument that we begin on the left with the image, and then various kinds of processes go on sequentially until you actually perceive a three-dimensional representation of that image. And where you're left with is an image of the world, an experience of the world that's indirect, that's in your head. You claim is you don't really perceive the world. You perceive an image of the world that's been constructed in order to solve these problems like shape constancy and size constancy and so on. I'm hoping this is old hat to you and totally nothing new at all. Um, but notice here that what happens, and this stays with perceptual theory for a long time. The assumption is we begin with sensations, in this case, stimulation of the retina, and then somehow those sensations are converted into percepts. And percepts are what we experience, and we're disconnected from the world itself. Gibson objects to that entire approach. So in a paper he wrote in 1960, which will seem like eons ago for most of you, he begins this paper. It seems to me that there's a weak link in the chain of reasoning by which we explain experience and behavior. The weak link is namely our concept of the stimulus. So he's going to re-examine everything I just said to you and approach from a different vantage point. He rejects the view that I laid out for you earlier. He rejects that sensations are the starting point of perceiving. And he rejects the notion of a stationary perceiver. Instead, his beginning point is perceiving from a moving point of observation. And what this figure represents is, some of you may be familiar with, is his really early work trying to understand how pilots bring planes into landing. He's looking at this optical flow of information. And what's important about it's relational information. That this optical flow is information specified by the relative movements of the positions in the field of view simultaneously. So we're getting away from a stationary perceiver and moving toward a moving perceiver. This is a better way to start Gibson's theory, an individual moving through the world, as opposed to a stationary perceiver looking out at the world. And why is that? As I'll show you, I'll argue, the properties of the environment are most readily revealed through action. So we start out by asking, what is the primary function of vision for animate organisms? And notice it's animate organisms, organisms that move around. The primary function of vision is not to capture an image, it's to guide action, as we can see in all these cases. So Gibson's approach to the whole problem is conceptualizing perceiving as really perception action, not just perceiving images. And I mean, importantly, and this is where his work develops in really significant ways, is that the action facilitates perceiving, as I'll show you. That we perceive the world in order to move around in it, but also our moving around in it facilitates our perceiving of it. How's that the case? Well, here's a simple example based on an experiment that Gibson did in the very early 60s. How do you perceive an object through touch? Well, and you can try this experiment at home. I mean, just ask someone to put an object in your hand that you're not familiar with and just don't move your hand around. And it's going to be very difficult to tell what that object is. As soon as you begin to manipulate the object, what it is becomes pretty readily apparent. That is, when we perceive through action. So if we started trying to understand vision with this model rather than the camera obscura, we would have saved centuries of problems that we had to wrestle with. Our exploratory movements help reveal, as we change the orientation of the object in our hand, what the structure of that object is. So the object structure is specified as we move around in it. That is, to use a different term, that what's invariant about its shape becomes apparent to us. And so the perceptual experience of shape comes about through engaging this object. The information for perceiving this object is what is invariant under changes produced by exploratory movements. He calls this a perceptual system. So whereas traditionally individuals who study perception are just looking at sort of receptors, Gibson's talking about a perceptual system which involves stimulation of receptors and the movement of the body. So let's begin with perceiving properties of the environment that are nearby. I just showed you one. Touching, you can manipulate an object. Tasting, you can swish the object or lick the object to let it interact with your taste receptors. Smelling is also an action. And this all comes about in the book, which I highly recommend if you've not read it. In my mind, it's one of the most important books of the 20th century in psychology. And the title tells you everything you need to know. He's getting away from the classical notion of senses, and he's considering senses as, in fact, perceptual systems. And by perceptual systems, he means perception action systems. So again, if you begin reading about Gibson in his last book, well, that's fine, but he doesn't spend a huge amount of time on this. And this is really the central part of his theory. He tweaks this a little bit in his last book, but again, this is just an amazingly wonderful book. So again, how do we begin account of perceiving? Through action, not through a fixed position. Okay. What about properties of objects that are distal, that are some distance from our receptors? Well, let's take hearing at a distance. And so I'll begin here because it's going to reveal some things that are going to be of great value to us when we talk about perceiving. So how do you perceive, let's say, a bell ringing at a distance from you? Well, we know this. We've known this for a very long time, and that is that sound waves are propagated through the medium of the air, because the air is not a vacuum. It has some density. and it travels from the source of the sound to another receiver, in this case, a pair of tuning forks. And so we understand, and we've understood for a long time, that hearing kind of works like this. But but notice when we went to study vision, we dropped all these considerations and thought about perceiving and detecting images. Well, Gibson's going to approach vision in pretty much the same way. We can talk about, again, we're still sticking with sound, that ecological acoustics, we're dealing with a source of energy, the medium, which carries the sound waves, and also that you can see that the sound waves can be directed to the perceiver, but they also bounce off of surfaces. So we're looking at sound as it's bounces off of and is structured by surfaces in the environment. And in acoustical design, we sort of take advantage of that by optimizing sound qualities, let's say in a lecture hall or a concert hall or so on. This is all very familiar. Let's just move now into vision. And if we want to see object properties at a distance, what do we do? And here was Gibson's really great contribution, I think, and it's the development of ecological optics. And I'll come back to this toward the end, but like when inaction theorists who are, pretty, I said, pretty popular right now, talk about Gibson, they leave this part out. And this is the critical part of his account of visual perception. So just as in the case of sound, there's an energy source, in this case, this light bulb. These are all diagrams from Gibson's 66 book. There's a medium from which the light travels, and there are surfaces which reflect this radiant source of light. And the reflected light produces an array of reflected light that's influenced by the texture of the surfaces, the orientation of the surfaces relative to the radiant light source, and so on. And so what you get is a medium of structure. This empty space here is where we might put a perceiver, but you can see that projected to an observation point that a perceiver might occupy, there are discontinuities in reflectances of surfaces. So for example, the top of this stool is going to be brighter because it's has a direct angle to the light source as opposed to the side. So the medium is filled with structured light. Also, the light's going to be structured by the texture of the surfaces. So what we see, and this is Gibson writing, is what we see is not a picture or not a projection, an image, or a picture, but a layout of surfaces. Now, I've yet to move the perceiver, so let's move him. So as the perceiver moves in this medium, this optic array, structured information is revealed. Invariant information is revealed. So again, perceptual system is the active organism functioning to reveal the invariant structure of the layout of the room. It's an information here, and this is if you're somewhat new to all this, the term information is used in different ways. In the traditional cognitive processing or information processing theories, information refers to what's happening in the system. For Gibson, information is the structure of the medium that specifies surface layout. It's not in the perceiver. It's revealed by a moving perceiver in the environment. And so here's my cheap animation that I borrowed from my friend John LaFlack. So as you're moving around, one is detecting invariant structure in that room, and perceiving is a matter of detecting or picking up that invariant structure. Okay, so now let's go back to a classic experiment, which I used to be able to assume that everyone knew in my audience, but now I've since discovered that isn't the case. So this is the classic experiment by Eleanor Gibson James's wife. In fact, she did this before the the 66 book was published, but it really helps reveal what he's talking about here. So the visual cliff was essentially designed to see whether newly crawling babies can detect depth at an edge. And so what the baby is, hopefully you're familiar with this, is located on this surface here. And the question is, can the baby be lured over the glass by this sort of this experimenter, or will the baby sort of see a depth at an edge? And if the baby does see depth at an edge, then presumably she will cross over it. There's a lot of many experiments done on this. I'll just kind of give you the beginning of it. So what you can see is that here's the crawling baby. These are different locations of where the baby's eye might be as it crawls closer to the edge. And you can see that moving from position 1 to 3 reveals texture at the lower surface. So there is accretion of texture over time with a moving baby that reveals that this depth at an edge. In other words, depth at an edge is revealed by the accretion of surface texture at the edge of this cliff here. There's been a ton of work on this, and what we do know is that even non-crawling babies can become sensitive to this if you put them in a device where they can move around. Okay, so action reveals information about environmental properties. Revealing the occluding texture of the lower surface of the visual cliff occurs through movement. That is to say, information is revealed through perception action. So I'm basically repeating the same thing I said before, but in this case, in terms of ecological optics. So you can see that what we're talking about here is not just projection of light to a perceiver, but rather this relational information that emerges through the reciprocity of perception action. So now we can ask, well, what is perceived? And we've already indicated one thing that we perceive, which is an event, which is depth at an edge. The crawling baby could essentially become harmed without the detection of depth at an edge. The other thing that can be perceived is that if you're approaching a surface, this flow of information that as you head toward the surface, that is to say you're detecting optical flow in the visual field, and the point of contact where the outflow of this optical flow is where you actually come into contact with the surface. So again, how do we perceive, let's say, that we're moving through the world? Well, it's pretty clear now, and with lots of empirical support to show that we're sensitive and responsive to optical flow that's generated by a moving perceiver. Importantly, as soon as you stop moving, the optic flow stops. Right? It's relational information. This has been demonstrated by these really fascinating studies of diving gannets. These are birds who feed by catching fish that are just below the surface. They have to sort of keep their wings spread out as long as possible to control the direction of flight, but they have to pull their wings out in time so that they don't shatter their wings when they hit the surface of the water. And so what's been studied particularly by David Lee in Edinburgh is that they utilize optic flow to do this. And we now know that babies do. David did important work on this phenomenon with children and adults as well. So the ecological approach to perception takes the individual as an agent. That is to say, the individual engages the world, it generates the flow because he's generating the flow. It's intentional. It's referential with regard to something in the world, and it's situated within this context. But the question you might ask, well, action with reference to what? If it's intentional action, what's the reference? Well, we've already seen generating optical flow, but another thing more broadly is what action is with reference to psychologically meaningful features of the habitat. And psychological meaningful features of the habitat will be like surfaces that you might collide with, but also objects that you might engage. So what is perceived are properties of features that are relative to action possibilities. Those are affordances. Affordances are possibilities for action. So let me give you an example here. This is a photograph of this plaza in front of this building. And I want you to notice this wall, which starts out because of the elevation of the landscape being very, very small at this end. And you can see there's hardly anyone sitting there to when you get to this end of the wall, that it's quite high. Now, why is it structured that way? Because the architects are trying to sort of maintain its orientation relative to the elevation of the land. But what it does is it creates places where you can't sit in one end versus places you can sit on the other. And here's a photograph of my two friends here, Joe and Phil. And as you can see, Phil is much taller than Joe, or at least he used to be. This is an old photograph. And you can see that at this end of the wall, Joe sits comfortably on it. And at this end of the wall, Phil does. In other words, what a Ford sitting on is relative to the perceiver. In this case, the perceiver's leg length. And there's been some really sophisticated research looking at the information that is utilized to perceive this affordance. The really ideal and prototypical work on it was done by Bill Warren. I can come back to it later if there's some question about it, but I'm not going to spend the time talking about it now. But notice that it's a relational perspective. That is, you're perceiving the environment in relation to action, or in this case, relation to body size. And it just in case you're wondering, so my one attempt at landscape architecture, landscape design, is we actually put a wall right here to sort of make up for this lousy wall that was there in the first, and that's that wall. And you can see that it's very carefully oriented to be sit-onable. This is the present appearance of that plaza. Okay, let's take another example. So here's a tree. And if you were an individual or a child, let's say, walking to the tree, you could see that it affords climbing. You can reach the branches look stable, and so on. Are all trees climbable? Well, not really. It's not the fact that it's a tree that's significant. What's significant is that it affords climbing, its relational properties, its affordances. And of course, if I assume that each of you sort of engaged in this as an activity that you enjoyed very much, because there's another feature of affordances we need to talk about, and is that they attract perceivers. They're motivating. So here's an example. If any of you have been walking with a child and you come to a ledge, that the child is going to almost certainly climb up on the ledge. There's a motivational component to perceiving affordances. There are action possibilities, and individuals typically want to engage them. Children cannot resist climbing up on ledges like this, or in some cases, climbing trees. And what they're doing over time is they're developing a perception action mastery. They're developing skills to engage the affordance. I think this is a really important and overlooked quality. And when we're studying the development of perception action, we do need to look at this question of perception action mastery. I've written about this in some of my work. Rob, excuse me. Rob Vidigan has written a book on the affective characteristic of affordances, and he argues that affordances often have invitational properties. They do not cause action, but they offer action possibilities. A silly example of this is bubble wrap. Which of you in manipulating bubble wrap cannot resist popping the bubbles? Now, obviously, this is an utterly trivial example, but I think it makes the point that objects have invitational properties. So, in summary, the perception action approach suggests that the environment is most basically experienced in relation to action. The environmental properties are most basically experienced in relation to action possibilities, which are affordances. And so when we're looking at the environment, we want to think about the environment, its action properties relative to some perceiver. And they may be different depending upon who the perceiver is, because after all, affordances are relational properties. People who have disabilities are going to perceive the world differently than people who are fully enabled. We know that. We try to make accommodations for them under these circumstances, or we should. Okay, so that's kind of my basic introduction to Gibson. And from these photographs that from Inger Lerstrup, who's a Danish researcher, you can see that these kids are in fact engaging the world in terms of these affordances. This is a wonderful study of children in forest preschools versus design preschools. If you're interested, I can tell you about this work at another time. So the psychological habitat, and that's the phrase I used at the outset, is describing the environment in psychologically meaningful ways. We can describe this scene here in terms of its properties for walking, for sitting, for running, for skateboarding, for bicycling. That's a psychological description of the habitat. Okay, so that's the main part of my comments. I'll come back to that if we want to. But I mentioned the inactive approach. And there have been a number of exchanges between ecological psychologists and inaction theorists. There are some ecological psychologists who feel that inactive theory and ecological theory can be synthesized. I'm not one of those people. I think they're really quite different, and I'll try to explain why. And hopefully I can give the inaction view a fair shake here. The starting point for an action theory is autopoiesis, which is a process of self-individuation. This is a single cell sort of establishing itself as a unit. It maintains stability, and in doing so establishes autonomy, what the inaction theorists call operational closure. So what establishes autonomy and stability are the interrelationships in the system. So the black arrows and circles are the organism. And notice that they're sort of all interrelated to one another. And then what's outside of the organism are these gray cycles. And notice that there are very few of the gray. There's some, but very few of the gray that affect these internal processes. And there's very few of the organismic activities that affect the environment, but not completely. There's a minimal contact between the two. But but which certainly the case is there's no organism environment reciprocity here, as I described earlier. The movements, the action of the system is not generating information about the environment. The operations in action theory are all operations within the boundary of a system. So the inaction approach begins with a focus on sensory receptors and effectors. So here's the classic statement from Varela, Thompson, and Roche. The point of departure for the inactive approach is the sensory motor structure of the perceiver. It's the way the nervous system links sensory and motor surfaces. In other words, this is sort of a diagram in their literature of perceiving works by linking sensory systems with motor systems. In other words, it's the linkage of sensations on the one hand and actions on the other. As Zico de Paulo has written, the sensory motor approach takes raw and quantifiable variation of sensory and motor services of the organism as a departure. Here's the environment, but there's no specification of what's in the environment. The theory of the approach by inaction theorists is one of the coupling of changes in sensations and movements of the body. So if you're getting particular pattern of sensations and you're moving your body, the movements kind of take into account the changes in the receptors, and then then the result is you perceive a stable environment. But I would claim that the inaction approach misses ecological optics, and it's arguably Gibson's most significant contribution. Sometimes in some of the writings, and I won't name names here, inaction theorists will use the concept of information, but they'll use it in the manner that I talked about earlier, as what's happening in the system. For Gibson, information is in the relationship between the organism and the environment. Inaction approach, the approach focuses on sensory receptors and motor systems, sensory motor couplings. And here's one diagram in one of their publications that demonstrates this. Here's the system. The system is active, and there's some kind of coupling with the environment. But notice this environment is empty. And so if we're talking about a coupling of the system from the environment, how can there be their coupling if there's no structure in the environment at all? So I was once at a conference with an action theorist, and the action theorist said, well, what we do is we talk about what's happening in the system, and we're interested in that, but then there's everything else. Well, the ecological approach is interested in everything else. It's not just a black box. So this is sort of a contrasting figures between the two approaches. So if you've been reading more recently about these two approaches, this is a critical difference of the two. There's a special issue of Frontiers in Psychology where many papers sort of talk about how to reconcile these two. I don't think they can be reconciled, and I make that argument in that paper. So yeah, so that's it for now. I can stop here for questions, and I have other slides in my back pocket that I can pull out if needed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this great presentation. We can take questions. Um, Before asking the question, can you please raise your hand using the reaction button in Zoom so that there won't be any chaos?
Stop share. Am I still
Uh,
sharing?
yes. Charles, please go ahead.
Hi, Harry. Great talk as usual coming from you. Um, I've been speaking with a philosopher of ecology here at Western, and we both have become, I don't know, not frustrated, but we both just think that autopoiesis is not actually a real thing.
Yeah,
Um, when you think about how even just a cell, how that maintains its organization, it's not a self, like it's not truly a self-organizing system. Would you say that ecological psychology is actually just inconsistent with the notion of autopoiesis itself? Like it wouldn't even get off the ground even just at that point in the conversation?
yeah. No, I completely agree with that. Yeah, because I mean, ecological psychology begins with the notion of an organism embedded in an environment. Now, anyone who's writing about autopoiesis certainly is talking about information crossing the cell boundary. or materials crossing the cell boundary and vice versa. But it doesn't carry much weight in the theory of an action. And that's where the problem lies. I feel, as you know, uh, I sort of see it as a form of idealism, where they're kind of creating an environment rather than engaging an environment. But I know my enactionist friends, including Ezekiel, would object to that statement. Good question, Charles. Characteristically, a good question.
Thank you. I see a hand from Rodman Institute.
Yeah, thank you. We've got a couple of questions here, so we'll do one, and if we'll do the second if no one else has raised their hand in the meantime. So, Varun.
Right.
Yeah, great talk, Harry. Thanks. I'm a PhD student here. I just have a question regarding this concept of a medium, because we've been talking of in ecological psychology, we talk about agents acting in an environment, and when we talk about the environment, we focus more on the observable, like ontological structure of the environment.
Yeah.
But another component of the environment is the medium through which agents perceive that environment. Because let's say if I see an object through air, it's going to be different from when I see the same object underwater. So the medium kind of shapes how we see the structure in the
Right.
environment.
Right.
So now my question is, this is like a two-part question. One is, should ecological psychologists pay more attention to the medium? And the reason I ask this question is because if you take ecological psychology to the social world, could we say that the social medium in which agents are embedded in shapes how they perceive the structure of that environment? For example, let's say right now I'm at the Rotman Institute of Philosophy, and I'm in a particular social medium. So I perceive the structure of the social structure, whatever that means, in a particular kind of way, compared to, let's say, if I was in a different lab, in an activist lab, and then embedded in a very kind of different particular social medium. So I
Right.
just see whether you have any thoughts about this idea of the medium, whether we need to pay more attention to this idea of a medium, the concept of a medium, and foreground that in ecological psychological research.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really good question. I just finished a paper yesterday that would answer that question, but let me try to and let me be clear. There's a handbook of ecological psychology that's being put together now, and my chapter in that will address that. But I think the idea of a social medium is not a very good idea, because the medium is still, in the case of vision, what information that's carried in the air. Or you're right, if you're interested in seeing underwater, we'd have to talk about the information that's available in that medium. But in terms of the question you raise, is we have a certain history in locations or situations, and so we develop over the course of our lives in essentially learning to act in particular ways in certain social contexts. If you've read any of my other work, I spent a lot of time writing about behavior settings. So I would say that it's not so much a social medium, it's that your actions are attuned to a social structure, which we can describe in various ways. And and what I mean by attunement, we can sort of explicate that in terms of various theories of social practice. And I know that at Rotman, you're going to have, either you just had, or you're soon going to have a speaker talking about social practices. So I don't think the medium really applies in the social domain, but rather how the actions of individuals take shape within social structures. I could go on, but let me make that as my preliminary answer.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, but let me add one other thing, and that is I think what's important, and the most important thing I learned from Gibson, I spent a little time with him, is that our use of language is critical. So notice the way I answered your question, I didn't disagree with your point, but I didn't want to use medium in that way, because I think it changes the meaning of that term. So I'm really sort of fussing with proper language. when I
No,
answered.
I understand. So the idea of a medium is more like an ecological concept, according to Gibson, whereas I was kind of changing the meaning by using it by importing the social connotations to that ecological concept, which you point out is not the right way to go about it, which I
Yeah,
think is yeah.
yeah, that's right. That's right. And so we act as social organisms in settings, and then we have to talk about how that happens.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you, Harry. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. I am kind of new to Gibsonian ecological psychology, so my question might not be relevant, but at least I give it a shot. So I tend to look at um, questions like perception and visual system from like evolutionary point of view. And then one thing that is kind of interesting in evolutionary studies of visual system is that it has a pretty conservative uh, history, and like the structures are layered on each other without like just radically changing. And also like we have these transitions in ecological transition in environment, that like organisms moving from like living in oceans to on land, or having a day having a nightlife, to organisms who like explore the environment mostly in daylight. And then my question is, if we put on too much emphasis on how moving around the environment will give us the structures, that an invariant structure, and then we perceive that invariant structure, it seems that the visual system will not will stay a bit more primitive, because it relies mostly on structures in environment, not its structure inside it, or like its computational processes. But it seems that with these transitions, we have some sort of attunement to different environment. So it seems that the mechanical approach and a level of computation still is kind of needed to for different organisms to have an attunement to that environment, and so they can detect the invariant structures in their environment. So
Okay.
should we draw a boundary, or like a threshold between where the ecological approach starts and when the mechanical or the information processing or approach kind of end?
Yeah. Well, let me say two things kind of quickly. One is I'm not talking at all about sort of the neuroscience that might be underpinning all this. There are people who have written about that. They're just beginning to write about that. And in fact, Mike Anderson at Rotman knows as much about it as anybody. So Mike can certainly fill in at some point. But the other thing that you should, in asking your question, is like when Gibson was writing, he was aware of this extensive literature where of how whether people can adapt to wearing prism glasses that shift the environment in so many degrees to the right or the left, or even reverse how the world looks. And what we know is that individuals can adapt to those. But reversing the image is pretty damn hard to adapt to, but it can happen. But shifting the array through prisms, individuals can adapt pretty readily. There's a interesting literature. So here's where I recommend you look. So I mentioned Eleanor Gibson in passing. She wrote a splendid book on perceptual learning, published I think in '69, and she has a great chapter in her book on that research on prism adaptation. So it really addresses the very question that you're asking. If we change the array even radically, can we adapt to it? And it turns out we can. As long as it's not, again, if it's depending on how radically it's changed, it might take a little time. And if you don't know this, and I'm sure Mike knows it, so he can tell you, on YouTube there's a film that Gibson narrated. He didn't make the film. The film was made in the I think the 40s. It's called Living in a Reversible World. And it's a film of these prism experiments. Um, Gibson narrates it because it was originally recorded, I think, in German. And Gibson, as a young man, was acted in theater, so he's sort of hamming it up in this. So it's really a lot of fun to watch. But I look at Living in a Reversible World, which is on YouTube, and it addresses your question. Um, Now, how you get to the neuroscience of this adaptation, I'm going to leave for other people like Mike to figure out. That's not where I want to go. I'm interested in looking at the nature of the psychological habitat, which is the environment. And I didn't use the word computation a single time in the past hour. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
So Eunice, I have a question, but I'll leave room for somebody else.
Um, is there anyone else besides Rotman?
I'm sorry.
No, no. I asked the
Oh,
question to the whole part.
okay, got it.
So you can go, Mike.
Yeah, thanks. It's Mike Anderson. Sorry, I'm over way in the corner here. That's just the structure of our conference room. Um, it's sort of a left field question, maybe, but you mentioned history and the history of interaction a few times. And one of the things that isn't dealt with in any detail, space is dealt with in great detail and importantly so, but time isn't so much.
Right.
Do you have thoughts on how to give a ecological account of time in these?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Gibson's written several things on time. One paper that is titled "Events are something like events are perceived, time isn't." We see the flow of events. So time, when we're looking at optic flow, we're looking at time. The things that he's written in his 79 book about how organisms move through the environment. And I think you might know that's where I focus on my early work. So as you move through the world, there are changes in the array, and these changes in the array are critical. So time is integrally tied with space. They're really not separable dimensions in a Gibsonian account any more than it is in contemporary quantum physics. So time is an abstraction, just as space is an abstraction. I mean, if in fact I would argue, Gibson argues there's no such thing as space. There's just surface layout. Now we can try to think abstractly about how we want to describe surface layout, and then space becomes a useful tool, geometric space. But those are concepts. Time is a concept. We experience events according to Gibson. Did I weasel out of that sufficiently?
Yeah. No, I'm just interested in it. I mean, this goes back to Aristotle for me, right? Time is the measure of motion.
Right.
And that seems to have been lost for a long time, that these were separate things. Obviously, it came back as time, space-time. But I
Yeah.
didn't know how to marry space-time up with Gibsonian ecological psychology. They seem on vastly different scales. Anyway,
Yeah. No. And by the way, there's a book that you may know that not this is not to an attempt to publicize my own work, but there was a book that was published. It's sort of a tribute to Gibson's 79 book, and various authors wrote about different chapters from Gibson's Ecological Approach book. And I wrote the chapter on the occluding edge. And that's really all about time, that chapter. So I'll leave it that for if anyone wants to follow up on it.
yeah, cool. Thank you.
And good to see you, Mike.
Sort of.
Thanks. Alex has a question. Please go ahead.
Calling on me, Alex.
Hi, Alex.
Hi, Professor Heft. Thank you for inviting me to the event. We corresponded about
Oh,
ecological sociology. So
oh,
nice to meet you,
you're that Alex. Okay.
man. Pleasure to meet you, Harry. Um, my question is a little related to that. So just for background for everybody, I've been a student of ecological psychology and the ecological dynamics approach for some time now. I've started really learning it in the last year. specifically in sport, mixed martial arts and football are the sports that I try to apply this to, and I find it very relevant and extremely interesting. But I'm trying to find the applications of this to sociology and how we interact with each other. And my question to Harry is, I feel like the literature of ecological psychology talks a lot about how we interact with objects and the field, and kind of like the inanimateness of the world and the affordances we see. And I'm curious if you think, or your perspective, if there's a difference between interacting with something like a doorknob or even another person you're trying to fight, and like you see the affordances and trying to interact with a body that you're in competition with, and one that is an actor capable of their own decisions and their own affordances and like seeing the
Yeah.
world and trying to interact with it in the way that you do.
Yeah, no, well, yeah, there is a pretty big literature on that question in terms of perceiving animate motion. And people have been looking at this for some time. So yes, animate motion is different from the motion of a rigid object.
Mhm.
Um, but since we've been emailing, I can send you some of those references at another time.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
But I mentioned to you in one of our emails Carrie Marsh's work, and that's a really good place to start.
Mhm.
Um, um, and um, and also some early work in this was carried out by James Cutting. So if you do a Google search on James Cutting's early work on animate motion, you'll see some pretty interesting papers.
Cool. Thank you.
Sure. Say hi to Baltimore for me.
I absolutely will, Harry. Thank you.
Thanks. Greg seems to have a question. Greg, would you like to ask your question out loud, or should I?
Yeah. Um, this was purely speculative. You mentioned time, and I've been aware of Stephen Robbins making an argument that although Bergson doesn't appear attributed in anything he's come across from Gibson, that there might be some strong links, and he finds it almost inconceivable that Gibson's work isn't dates back to some strong history of engagement with Bergson, and I was just wondering how you felt about that argument and whether it
Yeah.
resonates.
Yeah, I can say two things pretty quickly. One is so the book I published 20 years ago, half of it was making a case for the fact that Gibson's ideas very much come from a lot of William James's writings. And as you may know, William James and Bergson were they were soulmates in many ways. So a lot of what's in Bergson certainly is echoed in James. And so your question is really right on target. But on the other hand, why is Bergson not mentioned? Well, because Bergson, to many people, was arguing for a vitalism. And the people who want to connect with natural science are just not going to grab onto that. Now, is that fair? I don't know. I think Bergson is getting a new hearing today. He's being rediscovered, so it's worth looking up. But few people really sort of connected with Bergson after his death because he was seen to be in a vitalist camp, not a materialist camp. Yeah.
That makes sense.
Thanks. Is there anyone else who wants to ask a question or maybe a follow-up remark? Uh, okay, maybe I might have a question. Um, okay, when somebody comes across Gibson's work on ecological psychology, uh, one of the one of the first questions that comes to mind is how that motion-centered, movement-centered framework can deal with, or actually deals with, um, static images, 2D images, or videos that we are not able to manipulate that freely or interact with that freely. So
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so it's a really good question because, of course, if Gibson is claiming that, well, we don't begin vision with perceiving pictures, but by perceiving over things that are changing over time, well, plainly, we do perceive pictures. So how do we do that? And so Gibson did try to make a start on that. And so he published a couple of articles on the information available in pictures. And he, in the last chapters of his 1979 book, he comes to grips with that. I think it'd be a fair statement to say that he only got so far as answering that question. I think a lot more work needs to be done on that question. A good place to begin is I'm looking over for the title of the book. Yeah, there was a nice book that was published a number of years ago called Varieties of Realism by Margaret Hagan, who was a student of Gibson's, and she, sort of pushes that argument a little further. But no, that's certainly something that needs to be answered. Yeah, it's kind of remarkable, in fact, that we can perceive pictures. But notice that the argument, well, one argument would be that we might have to learn to perceive what's represented in a picture. Now, there's some counter evidence to that, but it might be that it's not so obvious. I mean, we can perceive things that are moving. Babies can perceive objects moving toward them, but to perceive what's the content of a photograph or picture, we need to know more about it. And there's an extensive literature, but I'll leave it to take a look at Gibson's writings. They're published in a journal called Leonardo on perceiving the information of pictures. I have oh yeah, I'll give another plug. I published an article a couple of months ago in the journal Ecological Psychology, where I try to offer a view of environmental aesthetics. And in there, I give a little summary account of Gibson's theory of perceiving pictures. So it's in like 2 months ago in Ecological Psychology, you'll find that.
Thanks. Greg, please go ahead.
Yeah, I was just hoping to go back to the theme of time, but on a slightly different front here. Um, Memory has played a huge part in cognitive psychology for a huge amount of time. And if you read up on lots of stuff in educational psychology and all the rest of it, there's whole approaches to education founded on what seems to be certainties about how memory works. And when I look at the way perception is understood through ecological psychology, I come to question virtually everything that I see everywhere about the whole concept of memory.
Yeah.
And I noticed Tim Ingold is now linking that to the question of imagination.
Mm-hmm.
Because it seems to me that we also need if we're looking at flow, it's connected to the future as well as to the past. And I was just wondering if you could point us in some useful directions around memory and imagination.
Yeah, yeah, Bergson. Because he made the same argument. He uses the term memory a little differently than Gibson would, but it's in Bergson. In fact, I think it's his second book is called Memory and Matter.
And have we moved on from there in recent years, or are we still kicking that can down the road a little bit at the moment?
Well, my non-answer to your question is the term memory means a lot of different things. And we use this one term to refer to different things. And so part of the problem in talking about memory and cognitive science is that they're talking about different phenomena. So for example, what's critical in like the mechanistic theories that I talked about is the momentary memory store on the retina that lasts like less than a second. Is that memory? Is that the same thing as you're remembering the birthday party you had when you were 10 years old? I mean, we're really careless and sloppy about the term memory. So I could wade in a little further, but I think I'm going to be conservative and say I'm going to leave it at that. I don't write much about memory, except if perceiving occurs over time, then there is a memorial dimension to perceiving by
Yeah.
definition.
Yes, as we perceive, it shifts our dispositions as we encounter new things. But that
Sure.
leaves a big question over what time frames that might happen over. I mean, it's one thing to look at this around the duration of actually consciously observing a ball flying towards you, but then we look at a time frame of, well, I saw you this week, I saw you last week, I saw you 7 weeks ago, and is that
Yeah.
also in that same frame? And I get a bit lost at that point.
Well, let me just also point out that if you ask sort of most psychologists and even laypersons what the term perception means, they wouldn't tell you it wouldn't have anything to do with what I just said for the last hour. They describe perceiving as like your opinion on something. So in other words, we're really very careless in the language that we use. So one of the things that Gibson's trying to do is nail down what we mean by perceiving. This is what we mean by that. Memory researchers could do the same thing and help progress the field. I'm not going to go out on that limb. It's too shaky a limb for me.
Thank you.
There's a question from Rockman.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Hello. Can you hear me all right? I'm at the other end of the room.
Is that John?
Yes. Hello. Hey,
Hi,
Harry.
John.
Hi. So I guess I have a historical question. I wonder if you've thought about it much. It's about the Gestalt theorists. So you mentioned invitations. Do you think that Gibson broadly agrees with the sort of descriptive claims the Gestalt people made in terms of what we can see? So, these two terms, meaning and value, are sometimes used when Gibson's characterizing affordances, and the Gestalt people use those terms too. Do you think that basically, tell me if you agree with this, do you think that Gibson broadly agrees with the descriptive claims the Gestalt theorists made about the sort of phenomenal character of things we experience, and also yeah, let's leave it at that. But of course disagrees with their explanatory apparatus, which involves this whole second world in the head.
Yeah. No, I agree with what you just said on both counts. Yeah. That he certainly was inspired by Gestaltists writing about invitational qualities. But as you said, their explanation, which has a dualistic flavor, is not one that Gibson's going to entertain. So yeah, I think what you just said is accurate.
Yeah, I couldn't see him at any point denying any of the sort of things the Gestalt people said about what experience is like or what we experience in the world. So yeah, so that's
Yeah. Well, Gibson has a very strong phenomenological dimension to his writings. He almost surely got that from the Gestaltists, but also that's why when Gibson came across Merleau-Ponty, which I think he probably did like in the 50s, he really resonated to that. He became sensitized, I would think this is accurate, to phenomenology through the Gestalt psychologist, but then, yeah, but so did Merleau-Ponty, for that matter. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks. It's almost been 1.5 hours, so I propose to take only two more questions. One from Zainab and one from Charles. Uh, Zainab, would you like to ask a question out loud, or should I read it?
It's actually not a question, but first a thank you to Professor Heft for this talk. I'm an architect by training, and I'm here only out of general interest. I'm following Yunus and Kogist closely on other occasions. And listening to you, I just flashed back to the student years where bugs and moving our designs
The audio is a little
in our
problematic
heads.
here.
So
Yeah, the same. There's a problem with your connection.
I was, oh, sorry,
Um, maybe
sorry.
I can try to.
Is it any better now?
No, it's not any better, unfortunately.
Feel free to write me if you want.
Her question is in the chat.
Yeah. So okay, I'm going to read it. I'd really appreciate reading recommendations in which environmental psychology meets architectural design. Uh, do you have any recommendations? Here we go.
Yeah. Uh, um, I, I've written a little bit about this over the years. There's a chapter I wrote a long time ago. Um, and certainly the example that I sort of went through really quickly about that, where the wall was sort of designed inappropriately to the body scaling of the users. I mean, so what happened there is that um, I interacted with some landscape designers, and we basically used Gibson's concept of affordances to try to create a social space that would attract people and that would prompt them to hang around. Uh, and so providing sittable space in public spaces will sort of encourage more social interaction. There's a wonderful film that's probably 30 years old now called The Social Life of Small Urban Spaces. It was made by William White, Whyte, and he doesn't mention affordances one single time because the concept wasn't available when he made it. But if you watch that video, and again, it's on YouTube, affordances are all over that video. And Eric Rietveld, who is in Amsterdam, has also written a bit about architecture and affordances. So you could check out some of the things he's written. He and his brother are architects, and they designed a number of things in Amsterdam based on some Gibsonian principles. If you'd like me to, oh yeah, someone just put that in the chat. But if you'd like to write me, I can probably send you some other suggestions.
Thank you. As for the last question, Charles, please go ahead.
Charles, this is not going to be about quantum mechanics, is it?
No.
Thank you.
So famously, well, maybe it's not famous and it should be famous, but ecopsych has not studied the chemical senses. It's not very
I should have predicted this.
and so I regard you as the living expert on what Gibson would say if Gibson was alive now. I think you've actually met him, which is not something a lot of us can say. So here's my question for you, which I would pose to Gibson if he was still alive. I think flow is super, super important to perception. In fact, I don't think you get perception without flow. But I do take issue with the idea that the perceiver has to be the thing that's moving around in order to detect flow. So sea sponges at the bottom of oceans and lakes, they get a kind of ambient flow that goes through them, and they are able to pick out ecological information in that flow of the water. Trees, I mean, very famously, quite stationary objects. Allowing that leaves can kind of move and different bean stalks can kind of go towards light and all that. would Gibson revise his theory a little bit just to maybe expand it more and say the key thing here is just flow more so than how that flow gets generated?
I am confident that what Gibson would say to you is, I look forward to reading your dissertation. Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at the very last sentences of Gibson's 1997 book, he says, this system I offer is not frozen. It's to be changed. It's to be revised. It's to be improved upon. So I think what you're suggesting is a perfectly reasonable thing to pursue. Yeah, I'm good with it, and I think he would be too.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm going to put that in my thesis then.
Yeah, blame it on me.
Thanks. I think that's pretty much it. Thank you, Harry Heft, for this wonderful talk, and um, thank you all for your questions and joining today, and video, and also thank you for your comments and contributions. Um, so
Oh,
goodbye.
one last thing. We have to wish Gibson a happy birthday.
Oh yeah,
Happy birthday, Jimmy.
birthday, James. Um, so have a nice day or evening. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.